Hello and welcome everyone to this MIPIM Connect session dedicated to the topic of embracing change with focus on global urban planning initiatives and their impact for the industry. Our expert today is Alice Charles, Lead Cities Infrastructure and Urban Services at the World Economic Forum. Alice, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Kenza, and thank you to all the MIPIM team for having me. So hello to everyone who's watching at home or in your office if you're lucky enough to be back in your office. What I'm going to go through today is emerging trends that we've seen in cities and indeed real estate as a result of COVID-19, and also a framework that we have been working on to transition the real estate industry post-COVID-19 and ultimately cities. So what I want to run through today, as I said, is first of all the emerging trends, secondly in cities, then secondly in relation to real estate, and finally the framework to transition the industry. So first of all, turning to some of the emerging trends and scenarios that we're seeing for cities around the world. What I want to say first of all is this is drawing heavily on work that we've been doing with our World Economic Forum Global Future Council on cities and urbanization, and indeed it draws heavily on work that's being done by cities that's part of that council, from Melbourne to Buenos Aires, etc. We are seeing trends in relation to a rapid move towards mass sustainable urban mobility. For example, we're seeing the use of bicycles really boom in cities like New York, San Francisco, Berlin, etc., Bogota, and indeed around the world. And this is asking questions of our cities as to how cities might enable more people to use sustainable transport modes whilst maintaining social distancing practices. Indeed, we've also seen a hurried transition to virtual delivery of services. And for example, we're seeing universities going online, we're seeing increased online retail, we're seeing indeed online telehealth. And this is asking questions of cities around how might cities support the rapid transition of services within their city to the digital world. We've also seen how isolation has intensified mental health challenges. And this is something we've seen right around the world, where people are increasingly lonely, particularly people who are on their own, for example, older people who've had to shelter in place or isolate. And this asks questions around how might cities support social connections during a time of social distancing. Also, we have seen open innovation flourishing, and whether that's in Estonia, who have been running global hackathons to solve COVID-19, or Indian cities that are crowdsourcing solutions, or in Germany, we are seeing increasingly how innovation is being leveraged to try and solve this problem. So in a cities-related context, they're asking themselves, how might cities involve others in creating solutions to novel challenges in the future? So all of this raises a number of issues and focus areas for cities. I guess cities on the one hand have to ask themselves, how might cities enable existing industry and business to transform and stay viable? And in the real estate context, that's very much true in relation to retail assets, in relation to leisure assets, in relation to hospitality assets. And how might cities encourage new industries and businesses to emerge and thrive in the city? And that's particularly in the digital sector, where we've seen this massive acceleration and adoption of digital technology in the last couple of months. Also, cities need to ask themselves, how might cities support changing urban land use, infrastructure, and space needs as a result, particularly if we see greater vacancy in relation to retail in our city core. What are they going to repurpose those assets with? How might cities accelerate our digital infrastructure while maintaining ethics and privacy? And how might cities understand the implications of systems change and what it might mean for governments and democracy? And I guess the final point is around how might cities maintain and develop a focus on community cohesion, mental health, identity, inclusion, which have been major agendas during this COVID-19 pandemic. But in essence, there's cross-cutting themes that cities are trying to address, which are around social equality, which are around climate change, resilience, prosperity. And in that context, we're seeing various holistic approaches being brought to bear. The power solution is one that's getting a lot of attention, the 15-minute city, which of course the Mayor of Paris, assisted by Professor Carlos Morenas, has developed. And that whole concept is that everything we need in terms of where we live, work, and play will be within 15 minutes of where we live. And we can easily travel by bike or walk to avail of those services. That is not new, of course. It's very much building on what Melbourne had already proposed a number of years ago, which was around the 20-minute neighbourhood. And I guess their concept was that within 20 minutes of where you live, you will be able to access recreational facilities, community gardens, green spaces, play areas, lifelong learning, local schools, local health, shopping centres, employment, and local transit. So, and you will have different types of housing, social and affordable housing within those communities, which will be mixed and integrated. And I suppose other cities, if we look at cities like Belfast, are thinking around how they can deliver a sustainable and inclusive recovery. And that's very much in the short term, driven by jobs-led approaches to community energy efficiency. Ultimately thinking about city renewal. How can you actually renew the heartland if it's going to be damaged as a result of the financial crisis post-COVID-19? And how can you accelerate the rollout of digital and sustainable infrastructure? I guess another movement that has to be recognized is what the C40 mayors have been working on. So here you have 95 mayors around the world who have been working together to look at what a green and just recovery could look like in our cities. And this work has been chaired by the Mayor of Milan, but I guess it's interesting to look at the principles that underpin that work. Cities may be coming from different contexts, but here are the 9 key principles that has underpinned that work. So they do not want the recovery to return to business as usual, because that would mean that we're on track for a 3-degree or more overheating. They want a recovery, above all, to be guided by public health and science expertise. They want excellent public services, public investment, and increased community resilience. The recovery must address equity. The recovery must improve the resilience of our cities and communities. And also they recognize, to address climate change, that we must leverage technology, for example, which already has been in existence, but because of cost, etc., hasn't managed to get to scale. They also want the recovery to focus on health equality and sustainability, and ensure that national governments support both cities and the investment needed in cities. And finally, they want to ensure that international and regional institutions invest directly in cities, which hasn't been happening before. So if I briefly turn to real estate, which of course buildings are a central part of our cities, what has been happening since COVID-19 in our cities? I guess there's different situations according to different asset classes. And even within those asset classes, there's different situations. In relation to living, certainly in the short term, we've seen that it's been very difficult to sell properties because virtual viewings just aren't what people necessarily want if they are thinking about buying that home that's going to be their forever home. They can go some of the way, but ultimately people want to see it in reality. We're also seeing that, and this was a situation that we've seen in China very early on, where prices were reduced to try and drive demand. And indeed, we're seeing that, for example, in the heartland of London right now. We're seeing apartment prices coming down and country house prices going up. We're also seeing moratoriums on evictions, for example, and that's something we've seen right across the world. And we're seeing reductions in international students, which is a huge bearing on demand for accommodation in and around universities. We're also seeing travel-related assets like Airbnb, for example, increasingly becoming distressed. And in relation to hospitality, we've obviously seen a huge fall off in demand for hotels, although some of that is starting to come back. And in relation to offices, we have embraced working from home. And I guess the question is, will we continue to do so? Albeit, I believe the office is not dead yet, because we do need that connection as human beings to drive innovation in our organizations. So we need to come together as people to enable that to happen. Also, we've seen in the retail sector where we've moved to online retail, and I guess that was an experience that we already seen in Asia, to a huge extent, where there was a huge focus on omni-channel retail. But that is a relatively sort of new idea in some parts of the world. So the question is, what will the retail that we want be like in the future? Certainly what we will require is less retail space in our cities and our towns. And retail will be more about an experience rather than the sort of big box retail shops that we currently have, as we will do a lot of purchasing online. We have seen increased demand for logistics, particularly associated with omni-channel retail experiences. So, what change is this going to accelerate in this new normal? In relation to living, we believe that foreclosures will accelerate in the coming months and years. This is particularly when government furlough schemes, which are offering life support, for example, to many businesses, is turned off. You will then start to see the layoffs, and then people will start to lose their homes. So the demand for social and affordable housing will be much greater. Before COVID-19, we already had a focus on net zero carbon buildings, but it won't just be in delivering net zero carbon buildings, but buildings that can also have added co-benefits in terms of health and wellness. In the short term, we're seeing less centric locations. So people are interested in the suburbs. They're not interested in living in the heart of the city. I think that will be a short-term issue. If we think about 9/11, you started to see office moving out of Manhattan and moving to more suburban and more rural locations. But that came back in time because they needed the ability to be in the heart of the city to be able to attract the talent that they needed for their businesses. Also, we will see more and more demand for health services in a traditional home setting as opposed to necessarily senior living accommodation. And, the question is, have we reached the inflection point of an already overheated student housing sector? Also, in relation to co-living, models may financially be strained given social distancing requirements, so investment may slow in that sector. In terms of types of accommodation preferred, will we want those large leisure assets? Will there be investment in hotels? Have we got too much hotels already? I think that we will see conversion of many of those assets as opposed to investment in some of those assets. Of course, assets in the very best location probably won't suffer. In relation to the office, it will be imperative to maintain safety, well-being, and sustainability in the design and layout of our office buildings. And we will have remote working, albeit we're likely to see people also spend time in the office. In relation to retail, the shift to omni-channel likely will continue, and the retail that we experience in our towns and cities will be experiential. And of course, in relation to logistics, as previously mentioned, we are seeing that huge increase and will continue to see that huge increase to service omni-channel retail. So what is required to transition the industry? What we've been working at the World Economic Forum is thinking about the long-term transition of the industry to ensure that it's sustainable. And in that context, we believe that the buildings that are created in our cities will need to be livable, sustainable, resilient, and affordable. And what do we mean by that? If we talk about livable, it's not just healthy buildings, but high quality, usable and smart spaces that enhance well-being and productivity in society. In relation to sustainability, of course, it's decarbonizing our buildings infrastructure. It's embracing ESG benefits. In relation to resilience, it's about enabling our real estate industry to withstand future shocks. And that's not just in relation to health, it's in relation to climate, it's in relation to financial shocks. In relation to affordability, it's ensuring that we have inclusive and value for money assets that contribute to shrinking inequality in our cities and for our vulnerable communities. And all of that will need to be enabled through digitalization and innovation, through regulatory frameworks, through development of talent and knowledge, value proofing, and finally, stakeholder engagement. And that means multi-stakeholder engagement to bring about the transition of both the industry and the transition of our cities. So, there are already projects out there that align with some of these pillars. And whilst I'm not going to go through many that we have received, but I'll pick out one or two that best exemplify what we're talking about. The first example I'm going to turn to is the Edge Olympic building in Amsterdam. And why am I picking this building under the livability category? The first thing is it appeals to more than livability. It also is a very sustainable building, and it's an affordable building when you look at the life cycle costs. So first of all, this is a building that's net zero carbon. It's circular. It's a retrofit building, which is located in Amsterdam. So the Edge Olympic building, it's a smart building. It enhances sustainability and employee well-being. Also, it's leveraging digital infrastructure to customize its environment. It's energy neutral, 70% lower consumption than on average. It's a non-residential building. It's used currently as an office building, and indeed it was used as an office building before. Also, this building has been able to adjust very, very quickly post-COVID. And I guess in terms of affordability, what is built in here is not the initial cost of retrofitting that building, but the actual operation cost, which has been able to be shrunk significantly over time. In terms of other examples, if we turn to sustainability, we are seeing examples emerge in the Middle East as well. And this example, for example, it's a project that was developed by Majid Al Fulton in the Middle East, Talal Al Ghaf Sales and Experience Center, which is part of a new development project that they're bringing forward. It's a net positive energy building at the core of the mixed-use development. And it's a landmark structure, so it's got a beautiful design. It's also a building that's passive, low energy, and it embodies the principle of sustainable development. So, for example, also during construction, they were able to save significantly on waste. It has a building energy performance that shows a 25% reduction overall. So it's all in all, it's a building that is net positive in terms of energy. If we look at the emerging markets, for example, this is a project in India, a very large development in southern India, where they embraced a holistic approach to waste management in relation to this office development. It's the RMZ Eco World project, and they have 40,000 employees on this site through 9 buildings. And what they focused on here was a holistic strategy to waste management, segregating waste at source, wet waste management, dry and reject waste management, use of technology for continuous improvement, and efficient waste tracking. So they were able to reduce reject waste by 60%, for example, and 94% of waste was recovered. So, it's a true holistic waste strategy that they were able to adopt in an emerging market like India. If we turn to resilience, so an example that I'm going to highlight here will certainly be relevant in the post-COVID context, because we will see many distressed assets, and particularly in relation to the hospitality sector. And here is an example of a hotel in Brussels, which they managed to turn around. It was mismanaged, and they fostered well-being and sustainability and restored the business to profit. So it's the ex-Sheraton Hotel in Brussels. And I guess what they were able to do as part of this project is not only redevelop, renovate the entire hotel site and deliver 500 rooms and 65 suites, but they were also able to double revenue. And that is a very significant achievement, and it's one to look carefully at, given that we're likely to see these assets in distress. Similarly, here's a public-private cooperation project in Baton Rouge in Louisiana, the Watermark renovation, which restored this heritage building to be transformed into a boutique hotel. And in that case, you have a 12-story building, 90,000 square feet with 140 bed spaces. And this was a public-private partnership where the state and the federal government gave 40% tax credits for the project. And I think we will see these mechanisms increasingly being brought to bear to restore some of these heritage buildings and vacant buildings in the heart of our cities in the near future. In relation to affordability, I'm going to highlight two projects. This is a project in development in the UK, which Gensler Architects is heavily involved in. And this is a new model for urban design that promotes health, well-being, and sustainable living, but it also promotes affordability. So in relation to Tipner, it's an area located in the gateway of Portsmouth City. It's a 59-hectare site. It requires multi-stakeholder cooperation to make it happen. They are looking to create 2,500 jobs. 4,000 homes are targeted, which would be affordable to the workers of Portsmouth. And the UK government has awarded 50 million to fund the project. So there's been a significant investment from the UK government as well to ensure that the project is delivered. But I'm going to turn to a different aspect of affordability. So this is the Podium Create digital twin project, which is being developed by Lendlease in Australia. And actually, by leveraging digital technology, we can also address the issue of affordability. And what they're doing here is creating an end-to-end solution using digital twin technology that generates optimized manufacturing and construction schedules. So in essence, you're sort of automating the process of the design of your building and leveraging advanced manufacturing to actually manufacture the buildings. So they are seeing a reduction in costs of around 20% by eliminating inefficiencies. They're also seeing a huge reduction in the amount of resources that are required to deliver the overall project. So in essence, what we're getting at here is, a sector that's inefficient. If you're able to leverage innovation and technology, it can certainly transform the affordability of the asset that we're creating. Finally, there are many examples around the world which are cross-pillar, which hit upon all four pillars that I just highlighted. And again, I'm going to highlight a project which is again in the city of Brussels. And this is the Tour and Taxi Gare Cornavin project, which is a huge redevelopment project in the heart of Brussels. And it cuts across the pillars of livability, sustainability, affordability. In this project, it's a large regeneration project of the Gare Maritime, which transforms a former freight station into a dynamic attraction offering retail, leisure, next generation workspace. So very much a mixed use development. And also the Park Lane residential project, which also offers affordable housing. So I guess some of the pieces to take away here is this is very much a project that is underpinned by livability. So, the Gare maritime modules are primarily constructed in wood to enhance comfort and improve the environment. It also embraces sustainability in relation to it being a smart and circular development. They've used wood, smart glazing, natural ventilation, rainwater storage, material reuse, etc. And it also embraces affordability. 20% of the residential units are affordable and they're completely integrated into the overall development. So in essence, I'm saying that we are seeing some of these projects, particularly in recent years, that have been embracing various aspects of this framework. But what we will need to see and likely will see in the coming years is projects that will embrace all four pillars. So I'm going to leave it there and hand it back to you, Kenza. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Alice, for sharing these insights. It's fantastic. I just wanted to maybe suggest a few questions to wrap up and conclude your keynote, if that's okay. And starting with this, perhaps you could say a bit more about the future, the pillars of real estate, the future of the real estate pillars you've mentioned before: sustainability, resilience, livability, and affordability.
Yeah, no problem. So I guess sustainability is one that was around before COVID. And that really came with the Paris Agreement. Also last year, the UN Secretary General had his climate summit. And out of that climate summit came a proposal to deliver net zero carbon buildings and by 2030 for new buildings and by 2050 for existing buildings. So that agenda was already on the table before COVID. but actually there's a realization that that agenda can deliver jobs. So we are really seeing an acceleration in relation to sustainable buildings. That there's a realization that a lot of the jobs that are being lost are at the lower end of the market. They're low-skill jobs. People will need to be retrained. And embracing energy efficiency and sustainable buildings can actually create a lot of jobs and can stimulate the economy. So that's why we're seeing an even greater focus than before on sustainability. In relation to resilience, this is something the insurance industry had very much on their radar before this. And indeed, the real estate industry to some extent. We did see how vulnerable the real estate industry was to a financial shock during the great financial crisis. We have now seen how vulnerable the real estate industry is to a health crisis, but there's the looming crisis in relation to climate change that hasn't gone away. So in that context, we are going to see a greater focus on making sure that the real estate that we design in our cities is able to withstand future shocks. In relation to livability, so I guess livability is certainly something that some cities had been very focused on. I mentioned Melbourne in the presentation, so I will mention them again. And I think they had, worked a lot with Jan Gehl to think about how we could create cities that are more livable. And in that sense, it means improving everybody's quality of life, creating better spaces. They're walkable, they're cyclable, that we create inclusive spaces for people of all ages and abilities. And certainly because we've been, if you like, sheltering in place and in our homes and in our neighborhoods, the quality of our spaces, whether it's our own individual spaces or our neighborhood spaces or the lack thereof, has really come to the fore. So, again, that's where the emphasis is coming from in terms of focusing on livability. Affordability was a crisis beforehand. If I quote a UN figure going back to 2016, they said only 13% of cities around the world actually provided affordable housing. And, UN Refugees now says that 1.8 billion people in our world either live in homelessness, informal settlements, inadequate housing, overcrowded housing. So the affordability challenge was a challenge before COVID. We expect it to get worse. It's got worse in the sense that people who are living in the lowest quality housing are experiencing the worst outcomes in relation to COVID-19. But the other side of it that I mentioned is what we do know is when we have a financial crisis, and a financial crisis is following the public health crisis, we know that there's more and more demand for social and affordable housing. What we do know in relation to the real estate sector is that historically they've focused on servicing the upper end of the market as opposed to the middle and lower end of the market. So there is going to have to be a switch to realizing that the industry has to accommodate the wider middle and lower end of the market because of the situation that we're at in our global context.
All right. And I would like to address maybe a second matter with you today, the matter of relationships between the public and the private sector. Is it time to reconsider private-public sector relationships in general? Is it a new era for other partnerships? What do you think?
Absolutely. The first thing is real estate globalizes in a recession. We often see investors, buying up distressed assets in many parts of the world. But what they still will have to do is work with multi-stakeholders at the local level to realize the value of that asset. And that means working with the city authority, who are the permitting authority, working with communities to ensure that the development is in keeping with their expectations, so they don't ultimately all object to the development. You need to bring the community with you rather than have the community against you. So you definitely need to have that relationship. But also from the city side, cities are heavily reliant upon revenues that come from property taxes, that come from sales taxes, and that connects back to real estate. So, if you start to see vacancy in retail, in hospitality, leisure, offices, that is a very real impact on the revenues of cities, and you could see cities going under as a result. So more than ever, they need to work with the real estate industry, with the communities, to start to think around, how do you rethink the core of your city? How do you repurpose some of these distressed assets? How do you get vibrancy back into your city? How do you get people back into your city and you know, using the facilities within the core of the city? So the need for you know, public-private collaboration is greater now than ever.
And maybe we could go back to another topic that you've addressed right before on your slides. That's the subject of distressed assets. What is the sustained policy required here?
So that's a very good question. I suppose if we turn back to the last financial crisis, we had a banking crisis, and of course, that was often related to lending in relation to real estate assets. And different solutions were brought to bear. In some cases, governments decided to bail out their banks, and they took distressed assets off the bank's balance sheets and they worked them through. In some cases, the banks essentially set up their own asset management divisions to work those assets through. I think this time round, we have many very indebted countries. The debt to GDP ratio is such that countries have already taken on a lot of debt to address the public health crisis. And will they have the ability to take on further debt to deal with the distressed assets crisis? Probably not, is the answer in many situations. So in that context, it will be banks working with, you know, real estate owners to come up with an alternative business case. And if they can't, you may end up seeing many of these assets going into receivership and seeing fire sales of distressed assets. So I think that there are many investors that are waiting for that to happen around the world, and particularly the assets that will be in distress are retail, because, you know, we're already seeing the likes of Zara announcing how many stores they're going to close across the world. They tend to be one of the front runners in terms of transitioning within the retail sector, and so they're moving their retail to, you know, the facility that they will have in the city or the town will be more to the experiential piece, so that you can experience the product, but you likely will buy the product online. So that means smaller stores. And in relation to hotels, many hotels will fail, particularly those not in the most viable locations. And I guess they are assets that could be converted to residential because of the way they're built in terms of health and safety, etc. But also we will see leisure assets like cinemas, you know, assets that rely upon large congregations of people. We will see a lot of restaurants go under. We will see pubs going under. So, you know, and also we will see some offices being vacant, particularly the lower quality, you know, offices. I think the grade A offices likely will survive. In relation to offices, whilst we are seeing some big announcements being made by corporates that they're going to move to 100% remote working or somewhere in that origin, there's some really interesting research has been done by MIT, and that is pointing to the fact that, you know, before COVID, we had formal and informal connections. So, you know, that meant that we worked with the people that we knew in our teams or closely related to what we did. But since COVID in our organizations, and they're using their own organization as an example, MIT, what we're just doing is working with our close connections. We're not working with our informal connections. And we need to break down those silos to be able to drive innovation within our organizations. So I do believe that through time, there will be a recognition that by virtue of us not having those informal connections at the water cooler or the canteen or whatever it is in an organization, you're not getting those informal working relationships which break down silos and lead to innovation. So what I'm saying is I think in the medium to long term, we'll see the return to the office, even though it may be in distress in the short term.
And to end this keynote with a positive note, what would be your advice to investors out there in this incredibly complex environment?
So I mentioned something earlier that real estate often globalizes in a recession. And in that context, it's investors who are looking for distressed assets in many different geographies. And certainly, you know, we see that's already the case. You know, we're seeing a lot of investors looking at India, for example, at the moment, because they had a financial crisis before they had a public health crisis, and now they have an even bigger financial crisis. So what I guess I would encourage investors to look for is invest in accordance with ESG principles. I think that they can get value from assets and still work very closely with the local authority and with the community and embrace best planning and sustainable development. And location matters. That's pretty obvious.
Location, location, location. Absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Alice, for joining us today. That was a fantastic presentation. Thank you for sharing it with us here on MIPIM Connect. I would like to thank all of the members of our audience for joining us today as well. Thank you all and stay safe.
Thank you. Bye-bye.